So now we're going to go on to the two types of evolution that we can have. So there's going to be two types, and the reason this is important to talk about is because when people are trying to figure out who evolved from who, it's really important to differentiate between convergent evolution and divergent evolution. So first, let's just look at the words. When two things converge, they come together, right? And when two things diverge, they go apart. So if you think about you have an ancestral species and that species changes into two different species, they're diverging from one another. But they probably have a lot in common because they have that common ancestor. So that's going to be divergent evolution. And so you've got the same species kind of branching out into two different ones. And so that's going to give you two species that have a lot in common. Now, an example of that would be, oh God, there he is again. If we look at this picture. So you can see that a bird and a bat have a lot in common. They have wings, they fly, right? And the reason that we know that they experience divergent evolution, one of the reasons we know, is because if we look at the physical makeup of their wings, they have the same bones that are inside of them. This one might have feathers and this one might have fur, but they still have the same basic makeup. That's a very, very good example of divergent evolution. Now, convergent evolution is a little bit different. Once again, here's a bird with wings, and then here is an insect with wings. So they both fly and they both have wings, but they are extremely different organisms that evolved in extremely different ways. And so what we call that is convergent evolution, and that's because they are so far on either side of the evolutionary tree, and then just randomly they both got wings and both got the ability to fly, and so it's almost like they're converging and becoming more similar later in the game. So convergent evolution does not suggest a very recent common ancestor like divergent evolution does. Okay, so that's the difference between the two, and we'll talk about those here and there later on. All right, so another thing that we should talk about briefly is that there are other ideas out there besides evolution, go figure. One of those is going to be natural theology. So obviously there's religion on, and it's usually on the other side of the spectrum from science. And then there's this field called natural theology, and that kind of combines the two. So it believes in evolution, but it says that there's some sort of greater being out there, whether it's God or whatever, that is kind of helping that whole process along. So there are ways where religion and science do come together. Most of the time, they do tend to be on opposite ends. Okay, so there's a lot of evidence out there for evolution, and one place that we look at a lot is going to be the fossil record. And so that study is called paleontology, and Cuvier is going to be like the father of paleontology. So paleontology is looking at rocks and trying to look at fossils and see if you can find, evolutionary relationships between organisms. So technically, a fossil is an impression of an organism from the past preserved in some sort of way. It could be in an imprint. It could be that the actual organism got replaced by minerals, and we'll talk about different types of fossils that are out there. So what's going to happen is you're usually going to find fossils in sedimentary rock, and that's going to be like sand and silt and stuff that basically will come down and form layers, right? And so you've got sand, and then let's say you have mud, and so on and so on, and then that pressure turns it into rock. So if you were to find a fossil, there's two ways that you can figure out how old it is. One is much cheaper, it's actually free. The other one, a little bit more expensive. So the first type we're going to talk about is called relative dating. And if you look here, this is a picture of how relative dating works. So you can see there's this fossil found in this layer up here, and this fossil found in this layer down here. So the idea is that these layers up here were the most recent ones, so that means that this guy down here is older than the one that was found up here. So have we found out how old they are? No, right? So it's not exactly the best science, but it's free. So let's go over some pros and cons. As far as the pros, it is cheap, it's easy to do, and you don't need any major equipment. The cons of it are plate tectonics and no accuracy. So we just talked about the accuracy issue, but plate tectonics is talking about, well, what if there was some weird tectonic activity that flipped that over? And now you're thinking something's older than something else, but it's actually younger. So you have to be careful with that. That's not as common, but still that's an issue that you need to discuss. The better type of dating and more expensive is going to be absolute dating. And absolute dating is actually measuring how much certain isotopes have decayed in the rock to figure out how old that fossil is. So, like when you go to the museum and they hold something up and say, this is 5 million years old, that's how they figured it out. So they have a formula, and all they have to do is figure out how much of one isotope is in there versus how much of the other isotope is in there, plug it into a calculation, and it'll give them a relative idea of how old that fossil is. So the pros is that it is pretty accurate within a couple, hundred thousands of years. When we say that the Earth is 4.6 billion years old, that's pretty good. Except for the cons that it's extremely expensive and you need major equipment to do it. So there's pros and cons to both of them. Obviously, if you can do absolute dating, that's much better. Okay, so the last part here is we're going to talk about other ways that we can look at evolution and how evolution has happened. So this is kind of like things that support evolution is the way you can think of it. So one way is with homologous structures. So if we take that word apart, homo means same, right? So these are going to be structures that have the same basic makeup that suggest common ancestry. So if you look here, let's see, here we go. You can see that the arm of a human, the leg of a cat, the flipper of a whale, and the wing of a bat all have the same basic makeup as far as the bones go. So what that says to you is that these all probably share a relatively recent common ancestor, whereas if I took that insect that was in that previous slide and put that next to these guys, you could see how easy it would be to say, oh, that one's totally unrelated to these guys. These guys are more closely related than that insect would be to any of them, right? So that's looking at homologous structures. The next field is going to be called embryology. It's also called developmental biology. And that's looking for similarities as things develop. And what they found is the more similarities they have as they develop, the more common ancestors they have and the closer related they should be. So if you look here, you've got a chicken embryo that's growing, and you have a human embryo that's growing. And you can see there are quite a few characteristics that are in common. First, they've got the spinal cord, which is a major one, but you can see they've got that postanal tail. Here's the postanal tail here. They have pharyngeal pouches, which are slits in their throat as they're developing. And they have a lot in common. Whereas, if you look at this sea star that's developing at that same exact stage, you can see, no, not really anything in common with those other ones. So that's another way you can look at common ancestry. The next field of study is called vestigial structures. And I like to call them the why the hell are they there structures. And so these are things that we have, but we don't really seem to use anymore, but they're still there. So why would we have them? A couple of examples. In a snake, they actually have remnant leg bones and claws. Whales have pelvic bones. And we have a couple of things in our bodies. If you think about it, we've got that tailbone, our appendix, our wisdom teeth. So there's a couple of examples of those in us too. And so what you can do is, let's use the snake as an example, you can say, oh wow, so they have the remnants of leg bones. That probably means they're pretty closely related to something similar that has legs. So stuff like that. So these guys, they think, evolved from mammals that used to live on land. And so they needed pelvic bones to support them, but as they got into the ocean, they didn't, right? So that's going to be the field of vestigial structures to look at common ancestry. Then the next field is going to be what's called biogeography. So bio is living things, and geography is where they're found. And so there was a study, tons of studies done on this, but these are on these little clams, and you can see that they found similar species here compared to this coast of Africa, and that goes back to when Pangea used to be together. So you can kind of figure out some sort of relationship based on how the continents have shifted. So that's the field of biogeography. And then the last field that we have, I can scroll down here, is what's called molecular homologies. And that's looking at DNA and their sequences. So obviously that's going to be the best. And so all you basically do is you get a DNA sample and you run it through a program, and that will tell you what percent similarity an organism has to another. For example, us and chimpanzees, I think it's 99 point something percent similar. So obviously that means that we are closely related, whereas if you compared us to a banana, I can't remember what we had. I think it's like 20 or 30% we have in common with a banana. So obviously, we're more closely related to a chimpanzee than we are to a banana, right? So the best, this is the best way to do it. Those other ones can kind of support it, and those other ones can be used in cases where you find a fossil and you cannot get DNA from it. So that's why it's important to keep these other ones going because there isn't DNA all the time. DNA degrades over time. It's very hard to get it from fossils. So that's going to be how we look at evolution. In the next chapter, we'll get into how evolution actually happens.